Hello everyone, my name's Cliff and welcome back to my channel. This is Cliff's Dark Gems. Today I'm going to be comparing and discussing two wonderful coming-of-age horror novels, Stephen King's It and Dan Simmons' Summer of Night. Stay tuned. Okay everyone, before we begin, let's just discuss what coming of age is all about. And really it is about growing up and becoming an adult, and that journey that all teens and young people have to take. Now, there are a lot of things that they have to go through, and a lot of themes that are kind of common in coming of age novels are loss of innocence, internal conflict of some sort, external threat or something that they have to face and overcome. It's also about love and about friendship, and about noticing girls for the first time, noticing boys for the first time. All of these come into play in these kind of novels. At some time or other we all have to take that journey, and all of us have gone through these things like growing pains, and it's common in any kind of novel that deals with children and with growing up. We've all been through it, where we have to find our own place in the world, where we make friends and we lose friends, we have those teenage hormones things, we have to face problems at school with teachers or with bullies, and it's just a common thing amongst all of us. We all go through it. So why is it such an important part of horror, and why do I think horror novels deal with it so effectively? Well, let's take all those things, all those challenges that young people have to face, kids have to face, and let's add in there a couple of other challenges like supernatural, terrifying monsters, or even more vicious bullies with switchblades, or abusive parents, troubling households. You add in this whole thing into the mix, and then you get novels like Stephen King It and Summer of Night by Dan Simmons. Okay, let's start off with just a brief synopsis, or just a brief summary of each novel. With Stephen King's It, you've got 7 kids who are living in the small town of Derry, and they have to face an unimaginable evil monster creature who preys on the children in the town every 27 years. And they also have to do battle against vicious bullies. And some of them come from abusive homes to make it even more difficult, and they have to struggle with basically terrible home life, and all of these factors come into play in the novel. In Summer of Night you have 5 boys, and later on a girl becomes involved, and it's the beginning of their holidays, and they also, summer holidays, and they also have to do battle against an unimaginably terrifying monster, or some sort of terror that's pervading the town. They also live in a small town. Now you might say, these two novels seem so similar. Surely Dan Simmons ripped off Stephen King's It, because it was actually written quite a bit after that. But we're going to take a closer look, and we're going to compare these two novels, and we're going to compare the plots, the themes, the characters, the settings, and you're going to find out that actually these two novels are very, very different. Wonderful, but very, very different coming of age stories. Now, before we really look into these novels, it's important to note that coming of age is the overriding theme in both these novels, and everything, setting, characters, ties in with that and makes it a very effective novel as a coming of age horror novel. Both It and Summer of Night take place in the late 1950s, in the case of Summer of Night 1960, and they both take place in small towns. And that is very important, because we get a sense of nostalgia. We get a sense of looking back at a simpler time where kids can just be, where they can run free, and where they can live their lives without so much of adult supervision. You also get that sense like kids now in modern times, they just hide behind their cell phones, they play their video games, they never get outside, they never roam free. Those times are long gone. So what's wonderful about both these novels is you just get that sense of nostalgia and that beautiful time when everything was simpler and life was free. Next up, we come to the most important element of a coming-of-age story, the characters themselves. Now, when you first look at it and you look at Summer of Night, you've got two groups of kids. In it, you've got the Losers Club. There's these 7 kids, and in Summer of Night, you've got these 5 boys that call themselves the Bike Patrol. Now, when you look at this, you think, come on, this is just too similar. It's kind of ridiculous. But we need to take a closer look. I think the biggest difference is that the Losers Club, the 7 kids, are really losers. They are rejects, they are outsiders, and that makes them a lot more vulnerable to things like bullying and basically vulnerable to the things that happen to them, so they have to be more close-knit. The Bike Patrol in Summer of Night, on the other hand, is 5 boys, and they're kind of the cool kids. They're tough, and they cope with the situations fairly well. In fact, you almost get the sense that they're not as well developed as the kids from it, but you also feel that every one of them is developed enough that you really get a kind of connection with them. But I would argue that in it you really get a connection with the Losers Club. Another reason for that is because the book is just so huge, so that there's enough room for character development. There's enough room for fleshing out the characters, so that by the end of the story I actually didn't want it to end. I lived with those characters. Whereas Summer of Night, although I loved the characters, I really enjoyed them, I just didn't feel that connection with them as much as I did with the kids from it. Another very important thing about it is that you see the impact that the trauma and the terror of this creature and of their upbringing and what happens to them has on their adult life. Because the novel is structured almost in a way of flashbacks. You see the kids as kids, and I'm not going to give away spoilers, but you also see them as adults and the effect of their childhood on their adult life. Whereas with Summer of Night, it does kind of cut off. They change, but at the end of the novel they are changed kids, but it's not as effective for me with it. It's a lot more complex in terms of the characters, this novel. One thing that Dan Simmons does a lot better in Summer of Night than Stephen King with it, in my opinion, is that he creates a sense of the wonder of childhood, of what it means to be young and to play and to be free. His boys are quite tough, and they go out and they play in the woods and they build forts and they play these rough games and they play baseball. There's just not a sense, the same sense of that in it. And I think that sense of nostalgia and of being young is just so well done in Summer of Night. Okay, let's talk about some other characters. Let's talk about the nature of evil in each novel. In Stephen King's It, you are introduced to Pennywise almost immediately in the first chapter. And really it is one of the most powerful, terrifying first chapters in any novel that I've ever read. And it's no surprise you see what Pennywise is all about. He takes a fear, your worst fear, and comes across as your worst fear, which is actually very terrifying throughout the novel. In Summer of Night, it is a slow burn. You don't really know from the outset what's happening. In fact, you only really learn what's happening towards the end of the novel. And it almost plays out more like a mystery. Terrible thing happened in the town. Okay, there's a lot of evil things that happen, but you don't know where it's coming from. You kind of know that the source of everything, sort of makes it clear in the beginning, is from this old central school. Now, like I say, it's a slow burn. And in both cases, there are also vicious bullies and terrifying bullies. In it, I'm not going to describe them, I don't want to spoil anything. And also some dangerous adults in Summer of Night. All this evil in both the novels just adds to the complexity of the challenges that these boys and girls have to face. And it just makes for just a wonderful coming-of-age novel. And just a more terrifying experience for these kids. But once again, I think it's especially true and more true for It, because the kids in It are more vulnerable. They are weaker, and they have to discover this inner strength, and they have to bond tighter together in order to combat this evil. Whereas in Summer of Night, these boys are very different. And in fact, there's some scenes where they have to fight against certain things that are just seem a little bit out of place in a novel in the 60s and something that kids could do. But hey, the Bike Patrol are pretty awesome in that sense. Okay, let's look at some themes that are prevalent in both novels. First of all, good versus evil. That's an obvious one, and we kind of dealt with that already. They all have to fight. In both cases, in both novels, they have to fight these evils. They have to overcome these evils. And what happens is this changes them as people, as children. And as I say in It changes them to the extent that because this novel takes place in two time periods, when they're adults and when they're children, you see the trauma of what's happened as when they're adults. You see the impact that it has both from childhood perspective and from the adulthood perspective. Whereas Dan Simmons' Summer of Night, the kind of story stops at the end. Perhaps there's going to be a follow-on. I believe that there are two follow-ons from this novel, but it's just a different thing, and it's a different feel that you get. Okay, other themes are obviously the nature of fear and trauma, and facing that fear and having the courage to overcome that fear. And in Summer of Night, the fear, some very common issues rise with the fear of the dark, and especially with these two brothers. The one brother is terrified of the dark, and there's an overarching theme about that, about the dark. Even with the town where these storm clouds gather and there's this massive storm, it's fear of the dark. Whereas Stephen King's It is very interesting how when you see Pennywise the clown, you see your darkest fear. So if you are terrified of snakes, you're going to see this giant snake. If you're terrified of spiders, you're going to see this giant, terrifying spider. And these kids have to overcome these fears. And that takes courage, and that takes bravery, and that takes heart. And both these novels have plenty of that. Another one is friendship. Now, the bond between the boys in Summer of Night, and at the end of the novel it introduces a girl as well, who's kind of a little bit of a reject. She lives next to the dump, and she's missing her brother, who actually disappeared on the last day of school, but she becomes kind of pals with these boys as well. So there's a very, very sweet friendship in this novel, sense of camaraderie, and there has to be for what they actually have to face. The same is true for It. These kids have to bond together more than ever, and they develop a real pact. And that comes to something that's a little bit problematic, hormones and love. There is a scene in It, I'm not going to gloss over it, I think everyone knows what that is. But also there's a scene in Summer of Night that some might call it problematic. But it is, in Summer of Night anyway, something about when we are children and when we are adolescents. It's about growing up, and it's about dealing with our hormones and dealing with those sort of things. Perhaps some of the stuff could have been left out in both novels, but that does not make for a bad novel. And that's something that I have to emphasize. I would still strongly recommend you read these novels. They are wonderful. Okay everyone, in summary then, I would like to say that It is one of my favourite novels by Stephen King. It is powerful, it is moving, and it really deals with the whole idea of kids so well. I think Stephen King writes kid characters better than anyone else, and it's just such a powerful novel and terrifying novel. Saying that, Summer of Night is also a terrific horror novel. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, which is very good. And I think it captures the idea of youth and me looking back and the more joyful times of when you could just play outside without worrying about anything. It captures those moments so perfectly. Roughhousing with other boys, and Dan Simmons writes that so beautifully. And so both novels in their own right are just wonderful coming of age stories. Okay everyone, so that's my comparison between two awesome coming-of-age horror novels, Stephen King's It and Summer of Night by Dan Simmons. Please let me know in the comments down below if you read either of those novels and what you thought of them. And if you enjoyed my content, please be sure to like and subscribe. Until next time, please take care of yourselves, keep those pages turning, and cheers.